A black veteran stepped off the bus. Duffel bag slung over his shoulder. Heart pounding with anticipation. After years of service overseas, he was finally home. But as soon as he set foot in the station, everything changed. A security officer, tall and rigid, locked eyes on him like a predator spotting prey. Within seconds, he was surrounded. No explanation, no reason. Step aside, sir, the officer barked, his hand hovering near his holster. The veteran, still in his service uniform, tried to explain, tried to keep his voice calm. I just got back. I'm heading home. But it didn't matter. What happened next was humiliation in broad daylight. His bag ripped open, his belongings scattered across the floor. A crowd gathering, whispering, watching, and just 7 minutes later, fired on the spot. The job he had lined up, the security clearance he had worked for, revoked with a single phone call. What happened next shocked everyone. Because one act of injustice set off a chain of events no one saw coming. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we dive in, comment below where you're watching from. And if this story moves you, don't forget to share. Because what happened that day was anything but ordinary. It began, as these things always do, in the quiet spaces between words. In the gaps where truth lingers unspoken. The airport was the kind of place where time moved in rigid lines. Where the weight of history pressed down on the present. Unseen but undeniable. David Carter stepped off the plane. His boots still dusted with the sand of another world. He had been away for years. Serving in a war that had no face but many names. He had fought for a country that had never truly fought for him. Had carried its flag across seas only to return to a land that saw him. Not as a soldier, but as something else. Something lesser. Something foreign. Something out of place. The moment his feet touched American soil, he felt it, the slow, creeping certainty that whatever he had been abroad, it would not matter here. The uniform, the medals, the quiet discipline written into his very bones. All of it would dissolve under the weight of their gaze. At the security checkpoint, the officer barely glanced at the white couple ahead of him, waving them through with the ease of familiarity. But when David stepped forward, something shifted. The officer straightened, his gaze turned sharp, calculating. Step aside, sir, the officer said, his voice carrying that particular authority. One that needed no reason. No justification. David knew better than to ask why. He had been here before. In places like this, where men who looked like him were required to be twice as patient. Twice as polite, just to make it through unscathed. He moved to the side, keeping his breathing steady. The questions came, sharp and cold. Where had he been? What was he carrying? Was he traveling alone? Each word was laced with suspicion. As if his very presence was an offense. The people in line watched. But no one spoke. Some glanced away, pretending not to see. Others looked on with that strange mix of curiosity and relief. The quiet gratitude that it was happening to him and not to them. A white woman in a business suit clutched her purse tighter. A man in a crisp polo shirt frowned as if David was the reason his day had slowed. The officer rifled through David's bag, pulling out folded clothes, books, and a photograph of his mother that he had carried through every battlefield. He turned it over as if it might reveal some hidden crime. Anything you want to tell me? The officer asked, holding the photo between his fingers like it might burn him. David clenched his jaw. He wanted to tell this man many things. About the sandstorms and the sleepless nights. About the men who had died beside him. About the way he had learned to carry his country even when it refused to carry him. But he knew none of that would matter. So, he simply said, "No, sir." The officer held his gaze for a long moment before tossing the photo onto the pile of his things. "You can go." David gathered his belongings slowly, feeling the weight of the moment settle into his chest. He glanced at the people still watching, their eyes flickering with something he couldn't quite name. Pity, discomfort, indifference. As he walked toward the baggage claim, he could hear the murmur of the terminal. The world moving on as if nothing had happened. But something had, and David knew, with the certainty of a man who had seen too much, that this was only the beginning. David Carter moved through the terminal, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder. His steps slow but steady. The weight of his return was heavier than his luggage. Heavier than the years he had given to a war that had left him with scars no one could see. He had imagined this moment before. The homecoming. He had thought, perhaps foolishly, that there would be some recognition. Some moment of acknowledgement that he had done something. That he had mattered. But airports are not made for men like him. He walked past the rows of shops selling overpriced souvenirs. Past the hurried travelers who moved through the space with the kind of certainty he had never been allowed. At the coffee stand, a young white woman in a navy blazer glanced at him. Then quickly looked away. He saw the way her fingers tightened around her cup. How she shifted her weight ever so slightly. As if preparing to move. To distance herself. It was in these moments. Small. Barely perceptible. That the truth made itself known. As he reached the baggage claim. The crowd around him thickened. He stood among them. Waiting for the carousel to creak to life. For the bags to appear in their slow, endless rotation. Beside him, a middle-aged white man in a gray suit checked his watch impatiently. Damn thing's taking forever, the man muttered. David nodded slightly, not expecting conversation, but the man turned to him anyway. Where are you coming from? David hesitated. He had answered this question 100 times before. But something in the way the man asked it made him careful. Afghanistan, he said. The man whistled, low and unimpressed. That's so? His eyes flicked over David's face. His uniform jacket slung over his arm. The tired lines around his eyes. Didn't expect that. David knew better than to ask what he had expected. The conveyor belt groaned into motion. The crowd shifted forward, eyes scanning for familiar luggage. David spotted his own. A worn black duffel. Military issued. The kind that had seen too many deployments. He stepped forward, reaching for it, but before his fingers could close around the strap, another hand shot out, pale, impatient. The man in the gray suit yanked the bag up, his brow furrowing as he turned it over. This yours? He asked. His voice tight, skeptical. David exhaled slowly. Yeah, that's mine. The man didn't let go right away. He lingered, his grip firm, his eyes searching David's face for something. Proof. Explanation. Maybe even permission. David held his ground, his voice even. I'd like my bag now. A beat of silence. A hesitation so thin it might have been nothing. Except that it was everything. Then, finally, the man let go. The weight of the bag shifting back into David's hands. Just making sure, the man muttered, turning away. David watched him go, the words settling over him like dust. Just making sure. He adjusted the strap of his bag and walked toward the exit. His heart steady, his mind sharper than it had been minutes before. The uniform, the medals, the service, it had not changed a thing. And he knew, deep in the marrow of his bones, that outside these glass doors, the city would not be any kinder. David Carter stepped into the sharp autumn air, the city stretching before him like an old, indifferent god. The smell of exhaust and concrete filled his lungs. A scent more familiar now than the dry desert wind he had left behind. He had imagined his return home countless times. But he had not accounted for this feeling. The weight of a place that had always demanded so much from him. Yet never offered much in return. He adjusted his duffel bag and moved toward the curb. Scanning the street for a cab. The taxis passed him by. Their yellow bodies blurring against the gray pavement. He raised a hand. One slowed, then hesitated, then sped off before he could take a step. He clenched his jaw. Another taxi pulled up. Its driver, a brown-skinned man with weary eyes, rolled down the window. Where to? Harlem, David said, tossing his bag into the back seat before sliding in. The city moved past them in flashes of neon and steel. People hurrying across the streets. Their lives untouched by his presence. He looked out the window, watching the neighborhoods shift. Block by block, the buildings changed, the faces changed, and with them, the rules of engagement. At a red light, a police cruiser pulled up beside them. The officer in the passenger seat, a young white cop, sharp-jawed and brimming with a power he had not earned, turned his head, his gaze locking onto David's through the cab window. It was a look David recognized. The cab driver shifted uncomfortably. You okay back there? David didn't answer. He was watching the cop watch him. The light turned green, but the police car didn't move. The cabbie tapped the wheel. "Man, I hate this part," he muttered. David understood exactly what he meant. A sharp burst of sirens. The police lights flicked on, bathing the cab in a violent red and blue glare. The cab driver exhaled sharply, pulling over to the side. The officer stepped out, his movements slow, deliberate. The second officer, the driver, remained in the car, watching. David felt his pulse quicken, but he willed himself to remain still. He had stood in war zones, had faced men who wanted to end him. This, however, was different. The officer leaned down, knocking on the cab's window. The driver rolled it down. "License and registration," the cop said. His voice was cool, impersonal. The driver handed over the documents without a word. The cop's gaze slid to the back seat. David met his eyes, unflinching. "Where are you headed?" the cop asked. David exhaled through his nose. "Home." The officer's lips pressed into a thin line. He studied David as if searching for a reason. Any reason to escalate. The silence stretched. Then, he flicked his gaze back to the driver. "Stay put," he ordered, retreating to the cruiser. The cab driver drummed his fingers on the steering wheel. "Damned shame," he murmured. David didn't respond. He had learned, a long time ago, that there were some truths too exhausting to speak aloud. Minutes passed. Then more. The officer in the cruiser spoke into his radio, glancing back at the cab every so often. The driver let out a humorless chuckle. "They're running your name, brother." David signed. He had fought for this country, served with men who had called him a brother in battle but would have crossed the street to avoid him in uniform. And yet, here he was, sitting in the back of a cab, waiting for permission to continue his own life. The officer returned, his expression unreadable. He handed the documents back to the driver. "You're good to go," he said, his voice lacking any real conviction. Then, as if it were an afterthought, he looked at David one last time and added, "Watch yourself." David didn't respond. He simply stared until the officer turned away. The cab pulled back onto the street. Neither man spoke for a while. Then, finally, the driver shook his head. "Do you ever get tired?" he asked. David let out a dry chuckle, though there was no humor in it. "All the time," he said. David Carter sat stiffly in the back of the cab, his hands resting on his knees, the city pressing in on him from every direction. Harlem loomed closer, but the weight in his chest only grew heavier. "You live here long?" the driver asked, his voice laced with careful curiosity. David nodded. "Born and raised." The driver exhaled. "Yeah, tough city. Tougher for some." David didn't answer. The driver didn't need him to. They both knew. As they turned onto 125th Street, David glanced out the window, watching his old world unfold before him. Storefronts with metal grates, corner boys huddled in loose circles, laughter and sharp-eyed wariness woven together in the same breath. Some things had changed, the glassy shine of new developments creeping onto blocks that had once been untouched. But other things, the important things, remained exactly the same. The cab pulled up in front of his mother's building. The steps leading up to the entrance were cracked in the middle. The bricks darkened with years of wear. He stepped out, his boots hitting the pavement with a dull thud. "Take care of yourself, man," the driver said. David tossed him a nod, slinging his duffel over his shoulder. The air smelled like damp pavement and distant grease, like the corner store and home all wrapped into one. He climbed the stairs, knocking twice on the door. It opened almost immediately. His mother stood there, smaller than he remembered, her eyes scanning him with the sharpness of someone who had spent a lifetime bracing for bad news. "You took too long," she said, her voice steady but carrying more weight than he could bear. "I'm here now," he answered. She stepped aside, letting him in. The apartment smelled the same. Fried onions, old wood, something floral and fading. He set his bag down by the door, his mother watching him the way she always did. The way mothers watched sons who had seen things they would never fully understand. "Eat first," she ordered, leading him into the kitchen. He obeyed. The meal was familiar. Rice, stewed chicken, collard greens, hot sauce on the side. He ate in silence, His mother sitting across from him. Her hands folded neatly on the table. People have been asking about you, she said after a while. He chewed, swallowed. Yeah? She nodded. Saw Mr. Riley at the store. Said his grandson just got back from overseas too. Got stopped by the police on his first night home. David wiped his mouth with a napkin. Sounds about right. His mother's eyes flicked up. Sharp and knowing. You? He hesitated, but only for a second. They ran my name on the way over. His mother exhaled, her lips pressing into a thin line. Nothing more needed to be said. After dinner, David stood by the window, looking out over the street. The city pulsed below him. Cars weaving through the night. People moving in that careful way. Always aware, always waiting. A knock at the door pulled him back. His mother didn't move. That'll be Ray. David hesitated, then walked over and pulled the door open. Raymond King stood on the other side, hands in his pockets, his frame lean and taut, like a man who never stopped watching his own back. His grin was sharp, familiar. Look at this, Ray drawled. David Carter, back from the land of the free. David smirked. Something like that. They shook hands. A quick, firm thing. Ray stepped inside, nodding toward David's mother. Good to see you, Mrs. Carter. She arched an eyebrow. You stay out of trouble? Ray laughed, but there was no real humor in it. I will try. David motioned for Ray to sit. His friend leaned against the armrest instead, watching him closely. Heard you ran into some trouble already, Ray said. David shrugged. Not trouble, just the usual. Ray exhaled through his nose. Man goes overseas, risks his life, comes home, and still gotta prove he belongs here. David chuckled, shaking his head. Are you saying I should have stayed? Ray's smile faltered. Nah, just saying nothing changed. David leaned back, stretching his arms over his head. That's what I'm afraid of. Ray studied him. Are you looking for work? David lifted an eyebrow. David Carter had seen war. He had walked foreign streets where his skin was not a mark against him, where his uniform commanded a kind of respect he would never know at home. But now, standing on the streets of Harlem, the war felt closer than ever. The night air was thick with city sounds. Sirens in the distance, the rhythmic bass of a passing car, the murmured exchanges of men gathered on stoops, their eyes watchful. David stood on the curb outside a bodega, his hands in his pockets, his thoughts unraveling. A familiar voice pulled him back. Carter. Raymond King stood under the dull glow of a street lamp, his face cut in sharp relief against the dark. He held a cigarette between his fingers, exhaling slow. You think about what I said? David sighed. I thought about it. Ray smirked. And? David shifted. He didn't need to ask for details. He knew what Ray meant when he said work. It wasn't the kind of work that came with uniforms or pensions. But it was work that paid. And in a city like this, survival was currency. I don't know, David admitted. Ray studied him, tapping ash onto the sidewalk. What are you waiting for? David didn't answer. You think they're gonna roll out a red carpet for you? Ray scoffed. Ain't no welcome home banners for us. The same country you fought for will lock you up before it gives you a chance. David's jaw clenched. I'm not looking for trouble. Ray chuckled, shaking his head. Trouble doesn't need you to look for it. It finds you. A gust of wind swept down the avenue, carrying the scent of oil and exhaust, of something fried and faintly burnt. Ray stepped closer. I'm just saying, Carter, you keep playing by their rules. You gonna find yourself on the losing end. David held his gaze. Maybe, but I didn't come back just to lose myself. Ray took a final drag, flicking the cigarette into the gutter. His grin never quite reached his eyes. Suit yourself. He turned and melted into the night, his silhouette swallowed by the city. David exhaled, rubbing his temples. He knew Ray wasn't wrong. The world hadn't changed in his absence. But if there was one thing the war had taught him, it was that survival wasn't just about making it through the day. It was about the choices you made along the way. David made his way home, his thoughts heavy. As he climbed the stairs to his mother's apartment, a shadow moved at the corner of his vision. He turned, his muscles instinctively tensing. A patrol car had rolled to a slow stop at the curb. Two white officers sat inside, watching him. One of them, a broad man with a weathered face, leaned out the window. You got business here? David's pulse quickened. I live here. The officer's mouth twisted. That right? David nodded, forcing his voice to stay even. Yeah, that's right. The second officer chuckled, shaking his head. Look at this. Man's got himself a uniform overseas. Now he thinks that means something. David felt heat rise to his neck. He knew this game. He had played it before. Name? The first officer demanded. David didn't answer immediately. He could see his mother's window from where he stood. The light was on. She was probably watching. The officer tapped the side of the car impatiently. You deaf, boy? David clenched his jaw. Carter. David Carter. The officer squinted. Military. Huh? David nodded. The second officer smirked. Ain't that something? Fought for this country, and now you're back here, standing on a stoop like any other street punk. David stayed silent. He knew anything he said would be twisted, turned into something they could use. The first officer shook his head. Just don't forget where you are, soldier. The words were casual, almost friendly, but David knew what they meant. He knew the rules of this war. 2. The car pulled away, leaving behind the scent of gasoline and something sour. Something that sat heavy in David's chest. He let out a slow breath, pushing the tension from his shoulders before climbing the last few steps home. Inside, his mother sat at the kitchen table, her face unreadable. Are you hungry? She asked. David shook his head. She nodded slowly. I saw them. David exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. Yeah. His mother folded her hands. Her fingers pressed together. You should be careful out there. David met her gaze. I always am. She held his stare, the weight of history settling between them. Being careful has never been enough. David Carter had long understood that survival was a negotiation. A balancing act between knowing when to speak and when to remain silent. Between stepping forward and stepping back. Between the war he fought overseas and the one waiting for him here at home. But the thing about war, no matter how much you try to sidestep it, it always finds you. The morning light was barely creeping through the city's haze when David left his mother's apartment. The sounds of Harlem waking up were familiar. Garbage trucks groaning down the avenue. The distant laughter of children on their way to school. The low hum of music spilling from a radio shop. He had a job interview downtown. A factory gig. The kind of work that didn't ask too many questions about where you'd been. Only whether your hands were steady and your back was strong. It wasn't much, but it was a start. David adjusted his tie in the reflection of a store window, smoothing down the edges of a borrowed suit jacket that didn't quite fit. He had worn a different kind of uniform once. One that made him stand taller. One that made men shake his hand and call him sir. But here, he was just another black man trying to prove he deserved a seat at the table. The subway car rattled as it pulled into 42nd Street. David stepped onto the crowded platform, weaving through the morning rush. That's when he felt it. The eyes. A quiet, heavy gaze pressing against the back of his neck. He turned slightly, catching a glimpse of a uniformed officer near the stairs. Not the same cops from the other night. But they all wore the same expression. The look of a man deciding, in real time, whether you belonged. David kept walking. Slow, steady. He had done nothing wrong. But that had never mattered before. He reached the turnstile, pulled a subway token from his pocket. Hey, you. The voice snapped like a whip against his back. David didn't turn immediately. He knew better than that. A hand landed on his shoulder. Firm, unyielding. I said, hey. David turned slowly, meeting the officer's gaze. He was young, maybe late 20s. But he carried himself with the kind of certainty that only came from knowing the law was on his side. Something wrong? David asked, his voice even. The officer's eyes flickered down, scanning him. Where are you headed? David kept his breath steady. Work. The officer tilted his head, smirking slightly. You got an ID? David reached into his pocket, moving slowly. He had been trained to move slowly. He handed over his military ID. The officer glanced at it, his smirk faltering just slightly. Are you in the service? David nodded. The officer studied the card. then handed it back with a forced chuckle. Well, look at that. You served your country, huh? David didn't answer. The officer clapped him on the shoulder. Harder than necessary. Good man. Just making sure you weren't causing any trouble. David forced himself to nod. To keep moving. To pretend the heat in his chest was just the morning sun. Because this was the trick. Wasn't it? They would let you fight for them. Let you bleed for them. Let you hold a rifle in your hands and take orders without question. But the moment you stepped off that battlefield, you were back where you started. A suspect. The factory was louder than David expected. Machines groaned and hissed in steady rhythm. The air thick with the scent of oil and sweat. He sat across from a pale, balding man in a stained white shirt. The foreman. The man barely looked up from his papers as he spoke. Say you were in the army. Yes, sir. The foreman nodded absently. Have you ever worked with machinery before? David straightened. I learned a few things in the service. The foreman grunted. That's so? He scribbled something, then finally looked up. His eyes scanned David's face. His posture. The way his shoulders squared. David recognized that look. It was the look of a man who had already made up his mind. We ain't got no spots open right now, the foreman said flatly, closing the folder in front of him. Try back next month. David's jaw tightened. The sign outside says you're hiring. The foreman sighed, leaning back in his chair. Listen, son, I get it. You're looking for work. That's good. But we're looking for the right kind of fit. David didn't move. He didn't blink. There it was. The quiet war. The war was fought in back offices and waiting rooms. In polite refusals and lowered voices. In the way a man can be told, without ever being told, that he doesn't belong. David stood, adjusting his jacket. Thank you for your time. The foreman nodded, already reaching for the next folder. Good luck out there. David walked out the door, his fists clenched in his pockets. That evening, he sat on the stoop outside his building, staring at the city as it moved around him. His mother's voice called from the window. Any luck? David exhaled. No, ma'am. She sighed. Dinner's almost ready. David nodded, but he didn't stand, because he knew this was only the beginning. The war wasn't over. Not even close. David Carter sat stiffly in the back of the cab, his hands resting on his knees. The city pressing in on him from every direction. Harlem loomed closer, but the weight in his chest only grew heavier. You live here long? The driver asked, his voice laced with careful curiosity. David nodded. Born and raised. The driver exhaled. Yeah, tough city. Tougher for some. David didn't answer. The driver didn't need him to. They both knew. As they turned onto 125th Street, David glanced out the window, watching his old world unfold before him. Storefronts with metal grates. Corner boys huddled in loose circles. Laughter and sharp-eyed wariness woven together in the same breath. Some things had changed. The glassy shine of new developments creeping onto blocks that had once been untouched. But other things, the important things, remained exactly the same. The cab pulled up in front of his mother's building. The steps leading up to the entrance were cracked in the middle. The bricks darkened with years of wear. He stepped out, his boots hitting the pavement with a dull thud. Take care of yourself, man, the driver said. David tossed him a nod, slinging his duffel over his shoulder. The air smelled like damp pavement and distant grease. Like the corner store and home all wrapped into one. He climbed the stairs, knocking twice on the door. It opened almost immediately. His mother stood there, smaller than he remembered, her eyes scanning him with the sharpness of someone who had spent a lifetime bracing for bad news. You took too long, she said, her voice steady but carrying more weight than he could bear. I'm here now, he answered. She stepped aside, letting him in. The apartment smelled the same. Fried onions, old wood, something floral and fading. He set his bag down by the door, his mother watching him the way she always did. The way mothers watched sons who had seen things they would never fully understand. Eat first, she ordered, leading him into the kitchen. He obeyed. The meal was familiar. Rice, stewed chicken, collard greens, hot sauce on the side. He ate in silence, his mother sitting across from him, her hands folded neatly on the table. People have been asking about you, she said after a while. He chewed, swallowed. Yeah? She nodded. Saw Mr. Riley at the store. Said his grandson just got back from overseas too. Got stopped by the police on his first night home. David wiped his mouth with a napkin. Sounds about right. His mother's eyes flicked up. Sharp and knowing. You? He hesitated, but only for a second. They ran my name on the way over. His mother exhaled, her lips pressing into a thin line. Nothing more needed to be said. After dinner, David stood by the window, looking out over the street. The city pulsed below him. Cars weaving through the night. People moving in that careful way. Always aware, always waiting. A knock at the door pulled him back. His mother didn't move. That'll be Ray. David hesitated, then walked over and pulled the door open. Raymond King stood on the other side, hands in his pockets, his frame lean and taut, like a man who never stopped watching his own back. His grin was sharp, familiar. Look at this, Ray drawled. David Carter, back from the land of the free. David smirked. Something like that. They shook hands. A quick, firm thing. Ray stepped inside, nodding toward David's mother. Good to see you, Mrs. Carter. She arched an eyebrow. You stay out of trouble? Ray laughed, but there was no real humor in it. I will try. David motioned for Ray to sit. His friend leaned against the armrest instead, watching him closely. Heard you ran into some trouble already, Ray said. David shrugged. Not trouble, just the usual. Ray exhaled through his nose. Man goes overseas, risks his life, comes home, and still gotta prove he belongs here. David chuckled, shaking his head. Are you saying I should have stayed? Ray's smile faltered. Nah, just saying nothing changed. David leaned back, stretching his arms over his head. That's what I'm afraid of. Ray studied him. Are you looking for work? David lifted an eyebrow. David Carter had spent years learning how to measure a man by his eyes. And in that moment, standing in the dim kitchen with two uniformed officers staring at him, he knew exactly what kind of men they were. The taller one, Officer Langley, had that smirk. The King David had seen on the faces of boys who grew up knowing they'd never have to answer for anything. The other cop, younger, quiet, eyes shifting slightly, as if he wasn't entirely convinced he belonged in this moment. David's mother spoke first. These men have been waiting for you. Her voice was steady, but David could hear the tension beneath it. Langley tilted his head, like he had all the time in the world. We have a few questions. David didn't move, didn't sit, didn't ask what it was about. Because he already knew. The foreman, the job that was never his to begin with. The way he had walked out of that interview with too much dignity. Too much certainty, too much of something they didn't like. Ask, David said. Langley's smirk widened. There was an incident at the factory. A break-in. A few things are missing. David just looked at him. That got something to do with me? Langley folded his arms. Well, some folks said they saw a colored fella hanging around after hours. And you were there, weren't you? The words sat heavy in the air. The accusation hidden beneath the politeness. Like a knife wrapped in silk. David let the silence stretch. Because silence had its own weight. Its own way of making a man show his hand. Langley's smile faltered, just slightly. David turned to his mother. I didn't take anything. I know that, she said. And she did. Because she had raised him. And that meant something. David shifted his gaze back to the officers. Are you arresting me? Langley exhaled, shaking his head. Not tonight. Not tonight. A warning. A promise. A reminder that they could come back. That they would be watching. David clenched his jaw. Then get out of my house. Langley took his time stepping back. Like he wanted to make sure David knew exactly what kind of man he was dealing with. The other cop, young, uncertain, hesitated, almost like he wanted to say something. Then he turned and followed Langley out the door. The sound of it closing behind them felt like the slamming of something larger. David's mother exhaled. Lord have mercy. David sat down slowly, his whole body tight, like he was bracing for something. His mother watched him, her eyes full of something deeper than worry. You all right? David didn't answer. Because he wasn't. Because he knew this wasn't over. because he could still hear the echo of Langley's voice in his head. Not tonight. Not tonight. Not tonight. David reached for the newspaper still sitting on the table. The job listings. The empty promises. The illusion of a way forward. He folded it in half. Then he folded it again. And again. Until it was nothing but a tight, crumpled thing in his fist. His mother said nothing. Because she understood. Because she had seen too many men before him reach this moment. This edge. This precipice. This place where a man had to decide what kind of world he was willing to accept. David stood up. Walked to the window. Looked out at the streets of Harlem. At the lights flickering in windows. At the shadows moving along the sidewalks. There was something waiting for him out there. Something he couldn't name yet. But he knew one thing. He wasn't going to wait for the world to change.